So welcome everyone to the Buddhist Path of Awakening course as we make our way through the profound treasury of the ocean of Dharma, the teachings by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, delivered at the annual seminary over the course of 15 years or so, and digested into the 3 volumes that we are working our way through. We are on the 2nd volume, the Mahayana, and tonight we are discussing chapter 30 on the 4th paramita, the 4th transcendent virtue of the Bodhisattva, which is virya, or sundro in Tibetan, and it means I'm thinking of energy. It's exertion in this chapter. It's often translated as energy or joy, but exertion. So Michael is going to start. Take it away, Michael.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you again for the opportunity to teach. Begin by saying a couple of things just to frame this that I think might be helpful, because obviously the idea of exertion implies, or is explicit, in presenting some kind of effort. And it's important to understand what that effort is on the Mahayana level so that we know what we're doing. And the effort in Mahayana really begins with the right view. And the view, which we've discussed and studied extensively, especially in the beginning chapters, begins with the discovery that we have inherent Buddha nature, or basic goodness, bodhicitta, awakened heart, whatever we want to call it. And what this means is that we don't need to create or fabricate something we don't have. And in fact, if we were to try to do so, that would be an obstacle to our practice. But rather, we have to discover who we are. And that this is the effort, this is the exertion. It's not to create or make something that we don't have, but rather to discover and develop confidence in who we are. So that you could say that really what it comes down to is recognition of our inherent nature, our Buddha nature, our basic goodness, our bodhicitta. And it's said that the initial discovery of Buddha nature is actually quite powerful, quite exciting. Shantideva describes it as being like a flash of lightning that illuminates everything in the middle of a dark, dark night. In other texts, the analogy is like finding a jewel in a rubbish heap, something just completely unexpected that's so valuable, so amazing. And from this, we work in terms of developing both relative and absolute or ultimate bodhicitta. So Trungpa Rinpoche says, and again, this is in the 1st chapter, that relative bodhicitta is the common practice of involving yourself in the world with benevolence, fearlessness, and kindness. And that ultimate bodhicitta is based on an enlarged sense of egolessness and combines shunyata, or emptiness, compassion, and prajna. And with this discovery and with this energy, we take the bodhisattva vow to put others before ourselves and to seek enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. And out of this, we work with paramita practice. So remember that paramita means transcendent action, which in some context, Trungpa Rinpoche has said is an action that has no reward for itself and that ultimately arises from twofold egolessness. So ultimately, it's enlightened action, action without confusion. And he also says in a different context that exertion is a thread that runs through our life altogether, that the thread of the continuity of awakened mind is exertion. So we'll begin with that, begin looking at this chapter on exertion. He begins by saying that it's been said that without exertion, all the previous paramitas are hopeless. Exertion is the most important paramita for us to practice in order to achieve the bodhisattva ideal and awaken absolute and relative bodhicitta. So having some understanding of the energy, the activity of a bodhisattva is really important here. And this is what exertion is bringing forth. Sondru is the word for exertion in Tibetan, which he says means becoming familiar with or getting used to hard work. The Sanskrit word is virya, which is often translated as energy or vigor, persistence, diligence, perseverance. And he says that the paramita of exertion is described as a good horse, joyful and free from laziness. And he says that exertion is connected with the idea of how to organize our lives as practitioners on the path. And there are probably a lot of ways we could think of what that might mean to organize ourselves or organize our lives. But I think that probably the most important point is that we are at this point really prioritizing practice, our practice and study as really important, as something that we need to do. And that this is what we exert ourselves in, is developing ourselves, developing our understanding, and developing our realization through study and practice. He says the definition of exertion is not giving up, and the nature of exertion is to be delighted in the practice. And one thing that I've sometimes taken from this, the idea that exertion is delightful, is when my practice is not delightful, then I need to self-reflect and look at what my expectations are, what I'm bringing to practice and study and my activity, and really look at how I'm orienting myself. And usually what I find is that there's some problem in terms of expectation or some type of goal-oriented effort, which leads astray. So that's what when practice is not delightful. He says the analogy for exertion is like a diamond, which is indestructible. And I think that again, in a different talk, I remember Trungpa Rinpoche saying, a bodhisattva never burns out. And for myself, who worked in the mental health field, and I know there are other people, burnout's a big issue. So I'm actually going to say some things about that a little bit later, because I think what he has to say about exertion really involves what it means not to burn out, not to give up. He says exertion is a way of developing an attitude of delight toward the path. When you feel delighted with what you're doing, working hard evolves effortlessly. So again, part of what makes it effortless, again, is just recognizing who we already are, what we already have. And in fact, as we develop confidence in what we have in terms of our basic awakened nature, at least the possibility of waking up, we realize we've always had that. And that this is actually exciting. This is actually energizing. This is a very powerful discovery. At the same time, he says, you have to encourage yourself to go further. When the first splash of delight comes along, you don't just gaze at it and hope for the best. You maintain it and develop it. So again, there is an effort involved here. It's not that we just let things be however they may be, but that we're actually orienting ourselves, working with ourselves in a certain way. He says, without exertion, we lapse into laziness, stupor, and slothfulness, even if we have generosity, discipline, and patience. He says that exertion helps us destroy the whole range of egohood, of viewing solidity as a big deal. And again, solidity being any sense of ego of self or ego of other, ego of phenomena, that we destroy the whole range of egohood. He says, again, that it's joyful and enthusiastic, and that in fact, exertion is large-scale enthusiasm. He goes on to say that if we put together generosity, discipline, and patience, they amount to exertion. As you go along, you're constantly building on previous paramitas, so that each paramita works further with something that we've developed in the previous paramita. The idea is to remember to practice one of the paramitas or all of them at once during your daily life. As long as you remember to handle yourself in that way, then you're practicing properly and you're completely steeped in Buddhism. If you begin to make a separation between dharmic practice and regular ordinary life, there is a problem. So again, one important point that he's making here is that we don't divide our life into what we do in meditation and then the rest of our lives, but that we come to see that it's one and the same thing. It's like ringing the gong and then the sound just rings out from there in terms of how practice could ripple through our entire life. And he goes on to talk about what each paramita overcomes. He says that with generosity, you're trying to overcome stinginess and selfishness, that with discipline, we overcome passion. With patience, we're trying to overcome aggression. And with exertion, we're overcoming laziness. And a little later in the chapter, he talks about what laziness means. So you could say, think of laziness in terms as indulgence, as well as slothfulness and ignorance. But that, in any case, each paramita has its counterpart. So the important thing here is that each paramita is a practice unto itself that works with something that could be a tremendous obstacle to us. So that, and each paramita is an attempt to work through some aspect of the entire range of egohood, I guess you could say. And then he goes on to say that there's another way to look at the paramitas. So again, it's really, I think, here trying to help us understand exactly how the paramitas work and how we can work with them in our lives. Beginning with this notion that we shouldn't be separating dharmic practice from the rest of our lives. But another way to look at the paramitas is how paramitas are paired up with either shamatha or vipassana meditation. In the development of the paramitas, shamatha and vipassana alternate 6 times. So he says that generosity paramita is connected primarily with shamatha, which I think in particular you could think about in terms of the letting go aspect of shamatha. That discipline is involved with vipassana, again, just seeing and understanding, maintaining some awareness of what we're doing, and extending, again, awareness throughout our life. That patience is connected with shamatha, which again, I think in particular emphasizes the settling nature, perhaps, of shamatha, you could say. And that exertion is connected with vipassana. So again, we're talking about vipassana, clear seeing, superior seeing. And in this sense, perhaps seeing more in terms of the possibilities in our lives and seeing more in terms of the appreciating each moment of our life. In any case, in this process of working through the paramitas and connecting the paramitas with shamatha and vipassana, he says the residues of shamatha and vipassana from the previous paramitas are not rejected, but the underlying heightened point of each of the previous paramita continues. So that there, as we move through the paramitas, there's an evolutionary process that we're expanding our understanding and developing our practice further and further. And again, this all comes back to the basic view of the Mahayana, that we fundamentally have inherent Buddha nature, enlightened genes, all of the things that we talked about in the beginning. And that as we come to recognize that this is our nature more and more, we're able to rest in this and expand this further and further into our lives. He goes on to say that the paramitas are mostly post-meditation practices, or we could talk about them in terms as meditation in action. He points out that you can't really practice generosity very much in the meditation hall. You actually have to go out and be generous to somebody. He says that in terms of paramita practice, the actual sitting meditation practice does not really change very much. It's more a question of how you deal with the feedback coming to you from the world outside. And this line in particular, that it's more a question of how you deal with the feedback coming to you from the world outside, I think really relates to what he says a little bit further in terms of seeing obstacles in particular with delight and seeing all situations as practice. And that we develop this capacity, we develop this ability to do so through our sitting practice, through our development in terms of shamatha and vipassana. But here we're extending it out into the world so that, again, ultimately there's no separation between our dharmic practice and regular, ordinary life. He says that our growing sophistication might take the form of shamatha or vipassana. With shamatha, you have a level of steadiness, and in post-meditation, it's a question of how much you maintain that steadiness. Shamatha is first thought, and vipassana is second thought. Shamatha is usually the instigator. It's how well you've been trained, and it is your education. With shamatha, you come across as a good, educated person. So it's through the steadiness of shamatha practice that clears the ground or makes possible our recognition of the clear seeing that is vipassana practice. That again, it comes down to having the steadiness, the stability of mind to be able to recognize in our experience our enlightened qualities. That again, we don't need to create or fabricate. And that in fact, if we do attempt to fabricate or create, it becomes an obstacle because usually it's some kind of an ego creation. So the next section was titled Smiling at Obstacles. And he starts this by saying that the ultimate meaning of Sondru or exertion is joy. He goes on to say that exertion means appreciating virtue. So I looked up the exact definition of virtue, and it means the quality of doing what is right and avoiding what is wrong. It's also sometimes equated with moral excellence. But I think that here again, this is one of the many ways in which our Hinayana foundation really connects with the Mahayana, because so much of the Hinayana is learning to recognize and refrain from states of mind that lead us to cause harm to ourselves and others, that generate further confusion, and instead try to cultivate or relax into a state of mind where we experience some clarity and wakefulness. But in any case, he says that exertion means appreciating virtue rather than just working hard. And I think this is the first point at which he's saying something that could help us avoid burnout. Because a lot of times burnout happens from working too hard and too much of a project mentality or too much goal orientation, so that we neglect self-care, we neglect self-compassion, we lose perspective and just get caught up in working too hard. So again, if we remember that delight is the hallmark of exertion, this serves as some kind of indication to us of how we should be experiencing our practice and our study. He goes on to say that holding on to seriousness or working hard can be a form of self-protection. And he says you do not want to face facts, which I think is, again, an important line that perhaps refers back to what he said previously about learning how to deal with the feedback that the world presents to us. That in fact, one aspect of our practice is being able to be with things as they are, rather than having to edit or change our experience in some way. He says when you accept the pain or obstacle, then it becomes like Tonglen. There's the possibility of joy. So this is what happens when we do face the facts, or when we are open to learning something from the feedback that comes at us from the world. He says with exertion, you appreciate virtue because you begin to feel what you are doing is right and best, and it feels good to do it. So that there's joy in just knowing that we're doing the right thing, that we're not causing further harm, further confusion for ourselves and others as best we can. Obviously we're on a path and we're learning from our mistakes and doing the best that we can. But he says, for example, you never get tired of taking showers, seeing the sunlight, eating breakfast for lunch or dinner. You feel that these things are an integral part of your life. He says there seem to be a lot of situations where obstacles are trying to push us backward. Nonetheless, with exertion, we do not give up and we do not expect others to support us as an automatic response. So I underlined automatic response because I think what he's talking about here is recognizing our habitual patterns for how we deal with obstacles when they do arise. And that what he's saying is we should not give up and we should not expect necessarily others to support us, but to realize that we need to face facts, deal with the feedback of the world on our own. He says, quite the contrary, what we try to keep going and to become completely fearless. We never lose heart and never look for alternatives unless the situation is really, absolutely, fundamentally hopeless, utterly unworkable. Otherwise, we do not give up. So we have to be realistic. There may be situations where, given circumstances and given what we're able to bring to a situation, where a situation really is absolutely fundamentally hopeless and utterly unworkable. But I think he's really pointing out that we really need to make an effort. We really need to try. He says you cannot expect an easy journey, an easy situation, or easy circumstances. And I think this is the second point, by the way, in terms of dealing with burnout, is giving up expectations, recognizing our expectations and learning to let go or relax so that we don't overburden ourselves or overburden others by expecting too much. He gives us an example of the story of Milarepa, which I heard a talk sometime in the last year about this very same point, where Milarepa, after several years of practice, comes back home. And what he finds is his house is destroyed, his mother is dead, he finds her bones. It's very elaborate, and there's quite a song to it. So obviously he's saddened by this, but at the same time, he really takes it as a teaching about impermanence and a teaching about letting go, so that he does not become discouraged, he does not give up. He takes it as further inspiration for his practice. And I was trying to see if I could find the song of Milarepa, but I was not able to do that. But in any case, the point that Trungpa Rinpoche makes is that in the Buddhist tradition, we try to rejoice whenever there is an obstacle. We try to regard an obstacle as something that makes us smile. So this may not be how we often feel. I can't say that I always feel that way when things don't work out. But if I stop and think about it, there are so many ways of relating to obstacles that are not helpful, usually because we respond to an obstacle from an ego point of view. We have some kind of goal in mind or something that we're trying to achieve. And when we encounter an obstacle in those terms, we feel discouraged, we feel frustrated, we feel victimized, we may feel angry at the world, we might feel let down in some way. So all of these do not make the situation workable, and in fact can make the situation much worse. So in fact, come to realize, if we contemplate what it means to meet an obstacle with delight, that he's right, that we're far better off. The situations are far more workable when we bring to a situation some sense of delight, some sense of workability, and are able to refer back to our practice. He goes on to say, I had a lot of obstacles, Trungpa Rinpoche himself. For instance, having to flee his country, give up everything that he had in Tibet and become a refugee, just for one. But he says, I do not regard them as a sign of anything. I again underlined the word the sign of anything because I'm not sure exactly what he meant, but my thought was that, again, when we relate to obstacles as some kind of burden or some kind of setback from an ego point of view, then we tend to take them as a sign perhaps that something's wrong with us or something's wrong with the world. Again, a point of view that actually makes the situation more difficult to work with from an enlightened point of view. It just generates more struggle, more self-criticism, more anger outward, all of which he just says, I just keep going. In life, you always have ups and downs. And in fact, just add that to not expect that is to set ourselves up for some kind of frustration. So again, some basic acceptance of things as they are. Or as he says, the feedback coming to us from the world, that we have to face facts as they are, and that we can do so with delight. He goes on to say that the more you develop, the more laziness and contentment could cause us problems. We might feel that the Dharma is old hat, as something that you've already heard. You start to think, why should I study these things again and again? And he says, with such an attitude, you begin to lose all that you have accumulated. You begin to lose your joy in practice. So I think we're entering into the third point about how to avoid burnout here. The essence of Sundru is to take delight in the practice you're doing and the teaching you're hearing as if it were fresh, as if you'd never heard it before. And this is exactly the same thing that Suzuki Roshi, by the way, talks about in Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. He says in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few, and that the goal of practice is to keep your beginner's mind. So Trungpa Rinpoche says what we could do is see that experiencing the Dharma is more of a privilege each time. He says the paramita of exertion is free from regarding ordinary activities as just boring. No matter what you do not regard it as merely a replay of something else that you've done many times before. The notion that things become boring when you do them again and again is just in your mind. So I think say a couple of things here. The first is that this is another aspect of burnout, is when we cease seeing things as being fresh, when we cease appreciating the moment for what it is, and instead start seeing everything as being the same old, or worse, and lack the ability to recognize the freshness and the uniqueness in every moment. And when we're able to do, on the other hand, when we're able to do this, and I think this is another way in which exertion connects with Vipassana, this brings us back to the notion of Vipassana as clear seeing, with appreciation, seeing possibilities, seeing the aesthetic possibilities in life. So that, as he says, whatever happens is new. And that this is always true, whether we recognize it or not, which again, just says something about the importance of recognition as part of our practice. So that again, we can bring a sense of delight to what we experience. He says, in bringing together patience and exertion, you're working with both the shamatha and vipassana disciplines. You're always taking a fresh approach to life, and you're not trying to look for new occupations or new entertainments. In other words, we're just dealing with things as they are without overlay of concepts, projections, expectations. And finally, he concludes this section by saying, although the occurrences of life may be repetitious, entirely repetitious, your perceptions or awareness could be fresh and extraordinary, and that gives you a sense of joy and cheerfulness. So that concludes the section that I was going to talk about. I think John's going to begin now with the next section, which discusses laziness and the obstacle of laziness.
Thank you, Michael. That was great. All of this takes place not in the context of our ordinary samsaric mind, but in the context and awareness that is beginning to develop through our practice and study of a very different world, the world of emptiness, shunyata, the twofold emptiness, meaning that the belief in I is beginning to be seen through, as well as the belief in other. And that also means that we are beginning to step into a very live, awake experience of life in this present moment, stripped to some degree, an increasing degree, of the passions, of the kleshas, those unhappy relationships that we have between I and other, the three root kleshas or defilements of passion, aggression, and stupidity or indifference, as well as the more complex defilements of pride, envy, lust, hunger, poverty mentality, and hatred and aggression. And these are the defilements of the six realms. And we are beginning to step out of that. Those are the accoutrements of the dualistic mind, the mind that believes in I and other, the mind that believes that life is a constant problem circling around me. And it's not that life is something else than me. It's just that it was a mistake that we had been making, and that we can cure that mistake by simply coming present for our lives. And then when we do, we begin to see the world in a more open, delightful way, a freer and more appreciative world. And this is what is being described by the paramitas. The paramitas are the way the Bodhisattva, the individual who has begun to discover this open dimension of life, is the way in which that individual relates to all the things in the world, starting with generosity. Generosity is a great joy, a great happiness. And in fact, it characterizes the very first stage of the Bodhisattva path, what's called the first bhumi, which is named great joy, pramudita. And it's great joy because in the act of giving, we can actually feel our hearts open. It's a great pleasure that the individual begins to experience. It's connected with shamatha because it's more of an experience that comes to you, suffuses you, rather than something you do, something more active like vipassana. And then the second paramita, which is discipline, has to do with coming present again. But now you're coming present in a way that is appropriate to what the world is asking of you, of us. And so we respond appropriately to the demands of the world. And when we respond appropriately, generosity is included, as all the paramitas are, each in the next. Because appropriate response to the world is with generosity. And then the world begins to become artful. We begin to have manners. We begin to dress well. We begin to express our appreciation of this environment that we're in. And there's a great joy in that, and a pleasure. And then we begin to develop as we step further and further into shunyata. The third paramita, which is discipline, which means absence of aggression, countering aggression. Aggression is always this warfare mentality that we can have with the world. And the third paramita, patience, has to do with countering that, eliminating that, beginning to move in a world without aggression, without this constant battle between I and other. And then the fourth paramita, as Michael described, energy, that beginning to move into this new world of generosity, appropriate action, lack of aggression. We are energized. We are inspired to act appropriately and to be involved in the world. And this is the fourth paramita, transcendent. Transcendent because all of these involve giving up ego, the sense of I. So we begin to move into this tremendous energy, responsiveness. We are inspired. The energy comes from inspiration. And in that energy, there is joy. The joy, the pleasure of relating creatively and appropriately to the world. The obstacles that he begins to outline, or one of the main ones anyhow, is laziness. Laziness is the natural enemy of exertion. It's a milder kind of fault, not nearly as severe as the others, the kleshas, the defilements, passion, aggression, ignorance, pride, jealousy, envy. He says it's like sleepiness. Somebody can wake you up and jolt you out of your laziness. And there are three categories of laziness, naturally. This is Buddhism. We always have these categories. The first is what he calls casualness, slothfulness, nyomle ki lelo. Lelo means laziness. You're tremendously attached to leisure, and you don't want to raise a finger. You want to lie around and eat bonbons and watch television, or whatever it may be. And you fight against a simple existence and regard urban delicacies as the only way to treat yourself. He says, you make excuses as though you were a victim of your life rather than just lazy. Sandro, exertion, this fourth paramita, which comes about in this atmosphere, you have to understand, this atmosphere of clarity, increasing clarity, because we're letting go of the constant dreams of I and other, those problematic I-other relationships. And we're coming into this very clear simplicity of the present moment. So exertion becomes the proper way of relating with your life. He says it is good scheduling and good organization. There's time for everything. And most importantly, there's time and space for practice. The third kind of laziness, actually, we'll jump to that because it's appropriate here, is the most dangerous type. And it's taking advantage of your life in order to avoid practice. Practice here means sitting on the cushion, sitting in meditation, but it also means coming present in your daily life and practicing these virtues, practicing generosity, practicing dressing well and being, eating properly and being artful in the way in which you live your daily life. Practicing in overcoming aggression in the various ways that he described in the last chapter. The first way of overcoming aggression is that when you encounter it, you don't respond to it. Someone is aggressive towards you and you feel angry, you feel hurt. Well, if you respond in kind, you provoke more aggression. So the first thing to do is to know, don't respond. And then the aggression dies out. And he says this is the most dangerous type of laziness. You take advantage of your life in order to avoid all the other practices of meditation and of the paramitas. Everything comes before sitting, study of the Dharma, and being a bodhisattva. Entertainment. Entertainment. We are addicted to entertainment. It pervades our lives. Even the news has become entertainment. Everywhere we look, there are excuses for entertainment to distract us from the unhappiness of the I-other dilemma, which is confusion, which is samsara, which is the whole problem that drove us to the spiritual path in the first place. And then, interestingly, he says, this is the second or the third kind of the problem with laziness. This is all under the category of losing heart. The fact that you could say this means that you are beginning to have a faint fever of what enlightenment would be like, realizing that you can no longer indulge in your samsaric world, so you begin to panic, because in your heart of hearts, you want to stay in samsara. It's so entertaining, and it keeps proving that I'm here, me, with me and my big problem. In summary, there are many other ways of indulging and cheating ourselves, avoiding virya, avoiding sundro, the energy of life. This energy is joyful because it involves an appreciation and an engagement with our life as it arises in this present moment. And it involves an appreciation and a confidence in our own Buddha nature that we're beginning to discover, that we can actually be free of samsara. So there's a great joy in this exertion. The problem comes when we don't want to work with the harsh core of being awake, he says. You prefer to take another nap. A nap watching television, going on a vacation, whatever it might be, another form of entertainment. He says, you would like to have lots of padding around you so that you don't have to experience the sharpness of reality. You could actually delight in that, but instead you shy away from it, that sharpness of reality. You would rather go back to your stable, which is full of shit and smelly. That's pretty graphic. When I did a spell check on this, my notes for this chapter, Microsoft Word didn't like the word shit. Thought it was a word that I needed to replace. He says that the three types of laziness could be overcome by having a sense of urgency and directness. Traditionally, exertion is referred to as joy in practice, and at the same time, a feeling of immediacy. If you're really practicing exertion, and then there's some classic analogies, you should behave as though a snake had landed in your lap. You don't sit around when a snake lands in your lap. Or constantly, throughout the tantric texts, they say, practice as though your hair were on fire. I guess practice is going to put out the fire. That's how urgent this is. If you stay too long in samsara, you're going to fall apart very soon. You have to do something to prevent that from happening. And then he likens it to vaccination. You have to do something before you actually get hit with sickness. Here we are. The sooner the better, because you will still be young and have some strength, so the sooner the better. That is the importance of exertion. And there are the three qualities of exertion. The first is called suit of armor, which is that you never let go of your desire to attain enlightenment, just as you would never enter a battle without your suit of armor. And really what's happening is that the more we begin to appreciate the logic of the path, that what we're doing is we're reclaiming our lives, coming back into full living. We begin to feel that this protects us from the neurosis, which is death-seeking. This path is life-seeking. It reminded me when I read this back in the day in the 60s, when people were dropping acid and other psychedelics, and a person might have a bad trip. And a bad trip meant that they were lost in unhappy thoughts, in the dreams, unhappy dreams. And I remember watching people having a bad trip, and they would get more and more constricted, pulled in, like this, and the color would drain from their face and from their eyes. And then as the trip ended and the bad tripness faded, you could see the bloom come back to the person's cheek. This is what samsara does. Those trips were sort of super samsara. In fact, that's what Trungpa Rinpoche once called LSD. He called it super samsara. And the samsara is retreating into the struggle of I and other, as opposed to the joy of shunyata, which is the freedom of movement in the absence of that I and other polarity. He says, this quality, this suit of armor, is based on a sense of joy. The joy and longing to attain enlightenment. It is like driving through a very thick, solid-looking fog. Although it looks solid, you know the fog is not a wall, so you can get beyond the fog and see the road. How many times have we all done that? Been on a road and the fog closes in and you can barely see where you're going, and you drive slower and slower and you're afraid of going off the road, and finally it clears and you begin to see the road again and drive. The second quality of exertion is action, which is overcoming the kleshas. You do not wallow in your own neurosis, but have a sense of joy in practicing virtue. And virtue doesn't mean being a goody-goody two-shoes. What it means is connecting with reality and appreciating the beauty of the other person and you and this whole environment. He says a quality of gentleness goes along with your exertion, so things do not become too speedy. Speed is one of the great indicators of neurosis. When people get neurotic and tense, they get very speedy. We've all experienced this. The second aspect of action is developing virtue. And this consists of perseverance, that you're willing to see through yourself completely, see your trips, your neuroses. You don't try to avoid it. It takes tremendous, sort of an acid courage to face one's own flaws and see them and realize that you can go beyond them. The second quality of developing virtue is joy, because you're beginning to feel that the world is sacred. Sacred means not holy in some religious sense. What sacred here means is that the world is of value in and of itself, for its own sake, for no reason, that it's worth being here for this life. That this life is fundamentally worth living. He says, whatever you do in the name of exertion, whether you drink a cup of coffee or wash the dishes or change the tires on your car, there is a sense of sacredness, which is joyful. It takes a lot of awareness to maintain that. Coming back. And immovability. You continue through all sorts of upheavals, kleshas, those are defilements and sufferings. And you don't change your mind or give in. Of course we do, but then we come back and we remember the path. We come back to awareness. And finally, the fifth quality of action is non-arrogance. You don't use your exertion to glamorize yourself. The last quality of action is working with others. It is not easy. It takes real diligence, and it also takes generosity. Here in Boulder, we've had these fires, 900 homes destroyed, just a space of a few hours, amazing. But the outpouring of generosity is monumental. Val has been trying to give clothing and things to help people who have been displaced from their homes, which have been burned. There's no place to give it because there's so much of it being given. There's just this outpouring of generosity. It's amazing. We heard that our realtors who helped us find our home, the realty office is very involved with helping other people. So we called up and we asked to volunteer. They were overwhelmed with volunteers. They've got so many volunteers, they don't know what to do with them. It's marvelous, this outpouring of generosity and kindness, triggered by this enormous tragedy. So, finally, the last one is never being satisfied. You're never satisfied with your exertion. That means satisfaction would mean, oh, now I can sit back and relax. That never happens. There's always something new to respond to. Exertion means being consistent, continuous, and faithful to the practice. And being consistent allows you to have a sense of joy, rather than seeing what you're doing as a duty. It says, when you have accomplished the three kinds of exertion and have mindfulness and awareness in your daily experience. This is the description of shunyata at this fourth level of the Bodhisattva path. So when you have accomplished the three kinds of exertion and have mindfulness and awareness in your daily experience, you begin to regard exertion as part of your basic natural activity because it's lit by joy, rather than as something that is imposed on you. It becomes part of your makeup. You realize that you're not fundamentally stuck in the mud. You can pull up your anchor and sail away. And then finally, it's almost, I think, an add-on. He talks about humor, that we not get serious about all this. He says, between the levels of patience and exertion, there is a point at which you can spark some kind of flash on the spot, a flash of humor. You can understand that in your ordinary life, you're extremely heavy-handed without any genuine humor. We're all so serious about what we're doing. You can actually find humor right now in this very second. Yeah. And when you do, you will feel that you have done something at last this very day, connected with shamatha and vipassana practice. So I'm going to stop there. I think the thing to take away from all this is that exertion, especially in other contexts as well as in this one, really amounts to finding joy. Joy in your being, joy in your involvement with the world, joy in your involvement with others. Just the generosity, just the making the gesture of genuine generosity to another person or persons can bring such joy, whether it's accepted or not. So I'm going to stop there and we could have a discussion.
Well,
I'll kick things off.
Okay, Ed.
And you know, I always come back to this, you know, when he talks about obstacles and dealing with obstacles. On page 241, he says, I myself have had a lot of hard times getting out of my country. And then if you read Born in Tibet, the stories that we read in today's newspapers of the various refugees all around the world, this guy was systematically deprived of everything that we take for granted, step by step by step. His home, his monastery, his friends were killed, his family was killed, and he barely escapes with his life, and it's over a long period of time. And yet he comes up and he says to us, you just have to smile at obstacles. And I guess to me that's a real proof of the pudding is the eating. He really talks the talk and walks the walk when you put those two things together. And it's when I see the various obstacles that I come up with, it pales when what this guy's been through.
Yeah, I've heard that he experienced a loss of heart at one point. It was in the transition from Scotland to America, and he was feeling that he wasn't going to be able to bring the Dharma to America at some point. But I never saw that. And by the time I knew him shortly after he arrived here. It was exactly as you described. I mean, from morning till night, utter cheerfulness. Now, he had had an accident, automobile accident in Scotland before he came to the United States. Everybody likes to say he drove a car through the window of a joke shop. Everyone thought that was really hilarious and appropriate, that it was a joke shop, whatever a joke shop means, I guess, some kind of place that sells humor and magic. No one knows exactly why. I don't know if he was drunk. I think one of the reasons that people give is that he had just come back from Bhutan and that he blacked out. It was having difficulty with the altitude change, and he blacked out behind the wheel of the car. He was taken to the hospital, and he wasn't handled properly. He had a blood clot that went to his brain. And eventually that blood clot disappeared, but while it was present, it resulted in a paralysis of his left side. And they should have treated that. But he was unconscious, and maybe they didn't even realize what was going on. They should have, for instance, what they should have done was taken his foot and stretched it so that the toes pointed up to the ceiling instead of flopped down. But they let it flop down, and as a result, his Achilles tendon shrank severely. And when I met him, his heel was at least 6 or 8 inches off the ground. He couldn't bring his heel down to the ground, and he had to wear a special orthopedic shoe with a brace going up the leg. Not only that, but his left arm was partially paralyzed from that blood clot, and his voice was changed forever. His voice was higher than it had been. I'd never heard it when it was before, but other people who knew him in Scotland told me that that was the case. So partial paralysis, he always moved his left arm around with his right because it was partially paralyzed. His face was very slightly partially paralyzed. This tremendous issue with his leg. He actually came to Boulder and had an operation here to lengthen the tendon. It was supposed to be the first of 3 operations. They spliced the tendon, like that. And they were going to let it heal and then splice it again and then splice it again. After the first operation, he said, that's it. He didn't want to do it, any of the others. He just lived with it, never complained. I never heard him complain once about his leg, either the operation or living with it. Instead, what I saw was a man who woke up in the morning, and as soon as his eyes opened, he was engaged with the people around him from then until the moment that they closed at night. I think this is an example of what it means to live your life with that kind of energy and joy and pleasure, constant interest, constant engagement, constant awareness. I mean, the hilarious things that he taught us to do to further our, is it discipline? Yes, discipline. Discipline is being awake and acting appropriately. And I think I've told you this, but there were the lessons on elocution, the rain in Spain. I can't do it. Falls mainly in the plain. My wife at the time used to go to those things. She called them electrocution lessons. He used to teach us these kinds of things, and on and on. So, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Thank you, Ed. Never heard a complaint. Our lineage, by the way, we're members of the Kagyu lineage here, is nicknamed the mishap lineage. Constant mishaps. So when things screw up, remember, you're in the mishap lineage. It's part of the ticket.
I think Jane has something.
Jane.
It's interesting because
On page 240, there's just one line that speaks to what you've been talking about, and I underlined it and asterisked it. It says, it's absolutely what you were just talking about with Trungpa. You do not want to face facts, whatever the situation may be. Now, I love this line. It's when I first read it, it's, what do you mean you don't want to face the facts? And then as you read it again, that's what enables you to move forward and to smile at obstacles. If you don't see them as a fact, you don't accept them. It's somebody else's fact. It's not your fact. So I love that line. It's shocking at first, but then it begins to make sense.
Thank you. Any comment, Michael?
I underlined the same line.
I should look at my book. I'll bet I did too.
No, I think it went right along with some of the other things he said about not wanting to face the feet, about if I find the exact notes. The actual sitting practice doesn't change you very much. It's more a question of how you deal with the feedback coming to you from the world outside. And a whole lot of Mahayana practice is really learning how to work with the world around us. And if we're not able to face facts, we're rejecting the world in a sense, and we're not going to be able to learn or grow or work with the feedback coming toward us because we're shutting ourselves out. And that's again why meditation practice is so important. He talked about shamatha, maintaining steadiness. And sometimes the analogy given, which kind of goes along with the notion of exertion as being like a good horse, is maintaining our seat, staying in the saddle. Being able to hold our seat, so to speak, no matter what we're riding through. And that's also an aspect of exertion.
Judy.
Yeah, what I see in that line that Jane pointed to again is the whole idea of wishing things were other than what they are, which I find myself doing all the time. I just catch it all the time, and I just shake my head and I say, whoa, there it is again. But I see the connection with not wanting to face facts. That's the form it takes for me.
What would happen if you did face the facts, stop complaining, stop wishing whatever it is were otherwise? Is that even conceivable?
I have to drop anger as a reaction when I see that. I become aware of the, wishing it were otherwise and resenting and being angry that it isn't some other way, the way I would rather have it. I see this with my husband a lot.
I think if you could overcome this, you'd be a great Bodhisattva.
Yeah. When I am so much aware of it, I try and pat myself on the head rather than kick myself in the butt. And that seems to help calm things down. And feel like progress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there anything we can do to help you?
Being here with you guys and with other people who are looking at things in this way. Big help. Big help.
Al and Dawn.
Yeah, this is so helpful tonight. Thank you, Michael and John. I've been struggling with the paramitas that seem to be aligned with Vipassana. And then it came to me, and I'll just try to tell this quickly. I was new to New York City. And one day, beautiful sunny day, I fell flat on my face. I was a mess. Well, the good news was I fell right outside of Lenox Hill Hospital. And somebody came out and said, "Would you like to come in?" And throughout the weeks that followed, the days, at first I was like, I didn't know what to do. It was crazy. My face was complete bloody, scabby mess. I went to work like the next day. My boss, he said to me, "Oh my God, what happened to you?" And then I was on a subway and somebody said, "Oh, what happened?" I found myself laughing at myself. And it was like, oh, interesting. I could have some kind of humor around it. I don't know where it came from. I was high on New York City. I was like, this isn't going to stop me. I'm just going to kind of go with it. And it was a surprise. And tonight, I'm reminded I haven't thought about that in a long time, but I realized I had that opportunity when I fell on my face. It's like, face the facts. And that kept coming up. I just had to accept it. Anyways, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you, Judy, too, for your comments. I get it.
Don, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just kind of making a connection that I believe Michael already made about this line that Trungpa talks about, "I do not regard those obstacles as signs of anything." And what came to my mind was that this story creation, right? Like, what a bunch of shit, and this is how it is, and look at this and look at that. And it's sort of that story with kind of resentment behind it that Judy was talking about, and it kind of grows and it gets lots of energy, and there's this choice about just like putting a pin in it, kind of, and like deflating it, like the thing that I wrote in my margin was opposite of setting sun mentality, and I think Trungpa used to say, like, cheer up. It's sort of like, I wonder if that's what he meant. Like, it's not in a glib way or a Pollyanna way, but it's just like stop giving that story energy, like even like what Val just shared, it could have been a totally different story, like my face, oh my God, what kind of place is this? New York City, and blah, 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 blah. But instead, somehow a different story was created around it. And then the other just kind of random thoughts, the other thing that came to mind was just the Milarepa and fish guts. So apparently, anyway, that's all I have. Anybody knows the reference to that? I was just recently started reading about Milarepa and some of his life or references to it in a book by Reggie Ray. And anyway.
Thank you. There's someone else who had their hand up. Oh, man.
Me? Yeah. I too had that the line underlined about facing the facts, and it says, but when you accept the pain, there is the possibility of joy. About accepting the facts, but also the line before that is what really hooked me, which is holding on to seriousness can be a form of self-protection. And I think this might have part to do with what Don was saying about when he would say, cheer up. But what that line said to me, because what was familiar to me about seriousness being a form of self-protection is when I take myself too seriously. And cheer up may be a way of saying, don't take yourself so seriously. Because just by definition, taking myself so seriously is the whole story I've created about self, right? And complaints are nothing but stories. They're just complicated stories or justifiable stories or stories with, justified resentments, and it really spoke to me, holding on to seriousness can be a form of self-protection, like somebody, either I'll say to myself when I'm aware of it, or somebody will say to me, Karen will say to me, lighten up, or you're being too sensitive. Being too sensitive is taking myself too seriously. That's what I got.
Kurt.
Yeah, on that same note, I find the piece around humor is like such a doorway into lightening up with ourselves and removing that seriousness. Once we see how humorous our situations can be, even when they seem so dire and so important, I think humor cuts through that, and I think it just has that almost like the worst case scenario to see the humor in it. I was assigned a job this week that was really going bad, and it was I was getting really wrapped up in it, and it's like it's not brain surgery. This is just a woodworking project that's going bad, and it's the worst case scenario is I could lose a lot of money, and the money was one thing, but then I was losing face. I said I could do this, and I might have to go to my clients like, I'm not good enough to do this, and I was taking that so seriously until I saw the humor in it, and then the lightening up of that allowed me to actually find the solution and the answer out of it. And as long as I was wrapped up in the drama of it, I was caught up into what was going wrong, and it wasn't until I could lighten up that I could see the solution through it. So I think that humor is a big piece of it. Thank you.
Robert.
Hi. I liked what you said in the end about being engaged. For me, it's a joke to me when I catch that I think I'm not engaged, because I'm always engaged with something, whether it's the suffering or it's the samsaric edition of life, or a sense of oneness. And it's choosing it and letting one run in the background. And being at one with things rather than letting duality run the show is really a very delightfully serious thing. In the sense that there is no separation really between Dharma practice and ordinary life. Ordinary life is the Dharma practice. I mean, what other life? We have another life? I don't have another life. I have this life. Like somebody telling me to change my mind. Is there something wrong with the one I have? You know, it's right here. It's right now. It's this. Have fun. And it's not easy, but it is.
Thank you. Well, friends.
You know, I'm just wondering if Randy has anything to say. I haven't heard from you in a long time.
Thank you for that invitation, Barry. I was thinking how I was equating urgency with speed in the beginning, and they're not the same. They're, in spite of me wanting it to be that way, urgency would be more like doing things and stop procrastinating and get to it. Whereas speed is, oh, I really I gotta get there as soon as I can. And so I was glad that I could come to the understanding that they are not the same thing. Because initially I was thinking that urgency and speed were interchangeable, and then they aren't. And I was happy to be able to distinguish between the two.
Okay.
You know, Trungpa Rinpoche talked a lot about speed, neurotic speed. And he identified some of us as what he called road runners. And I'm not going to say who, but a road runner, you see, there's nothing inherently wrong with speed. But when it's neurotic, you're using it to escape from your own mind and the tortures of your mind. And so he likened it to the roadrunner, because the roadrunner, you see, again, there's nothing wrong with going fast, but the roadrunner goes fast with blinders on. He gets the blinders on like this. It can only see straight ahead. And when it goes very fast in a straight line, and then it comes to a screeching halt and changes direction, you know, and goes another straight line. And he used to call some of his students roadrunners. That neurotic speed is employed to mitigate or to avoid the anxiety of neurosis, of samsara, that underlying anxiety And what we do is we get busy, it's, when we get to the Buddha families, there are different styles of how one avoids that anxiety. But one of the main ones is speed. Speed, you get really busy and you get speedy and you avoid your neurosis. But it can be, speed doesn't, nothing inherently bad about it itself. It's just when it's employed that way. But there are other things you can do too to avoid neurosis or to try and mitigate it. For instance, is another style, which is consumption. You go and you buy lots of stuff or you eat lots of food as a way of mitigating anxiety. Or sex. You can go and, have passionate encounters as another way of avoiding the anxiety of one's own mind. So these different styles. And there are others, a couple of others. We'll come to it at some point. Michael, you're muted.
Not anymore. I appreciated Randy's comment about urgency and speed. I think one aspect of exertion is that there's clarity and decisive action. And that's the idea of, for instance, the metaphor of a poisonous snake landing in your lap. Traditionally, that's supposed to refer to what we should do when we experience a klesha in our experience, that the kleshas are like a poisonous snake and that we wouldn't hesitate to do something about it if it's in that same way. We can be decisive in our action, combined with clarity, which of course refers back again to the Vipassana practice. And, so it's again another way that exertion relates to Vipassana.
Great.
Well, we're at 7:00. So come to the discussion tomorrow if you're inspired. And Meg, do you want to, somebody who's going to put up the closing chant. There we go.
We'll close by dedicating the merit earned by our practice for the benefit of all sentient beings. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Glory.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks, Michael. Thank you, John.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Everyone.
Thanks.
Hey, little honey. Little Minnie. Hey, little baby girl. All right.
Okay.